As the apparitions started to appear as dusk settled in, the girl, still full of innocence, never imagined that something so strange and unsettling could invade her life. But there, when the sun began to hide behind the mountains and shadows took over the world, the figures began to emerge. They weren't just silhouettes. They were almost real, as if fear itself was materializing in front of her. Sometimes a shadow here, another there, but always as the sun set. And when she looked closer, it seemed like they were just waiting for the perfect moment to approach. With the arrival of the moon, the horror intensified. The girl could feel their presence getting closer, as if something or someone was waiting, watching. It was almost impossible to escape the fear that consumed her, because the figures, which before seemed distant, now appeared to walk closer, as if they wanted to communicate. "Do they want something from me?" she wondered as the cold air surrounded her. The contours of the shadows came to life as the night deepened, and she felt as though she were being pulled into something bigger. It was a strange sensation, a mix of fear and curiosity, as if the very moon were calling them closer. And then the figures began to interact with her. They were no longer just random apparitions. No, they had a purpose. They asked for her help, as though she were the key to something far greater and darker. The girl, confused and terrified, tried to understand what was happening. Her mind couldn't process the terror and the questions that kept arising, like an endless storm. Why were these shadows here? Why did they seem so real and so hungry? What would happen next when the moon cycle repeated itself? The figures continued to manifest as the night deepened. Sometimes she thought she was seeing things, that the fear was playing tricks on her mind. But it wasn't. It wasn't imagination. When the moon was full, the shadows danced through the house as if they had a life of their own. It was impossible to ignore them. They moved from one corner to another, always closer, always more real. The girl, with her heart racing, felt powerless in the face of that growing terror. No matter how hard she tried to push them away, they were always there, closer than before. Over time, she began to realize that the apparitions weren't just random. They seemed to want something from her. Something more than just a casual encounter. The figures, with their vague and indistinct forms, watched her from a distance, always following as if they were waiting for a command. And the worst part was that with every appearance, an indescribable sense of horror consumed her. Her breath became heavy, her body cold, fear pulsing in her veins. It was as if something terribly bad was about to happen, but she didn't know what. The moon, in its fullness, seemed to be the point of convergence between the real world and the terror. And in this terrifying scenario, the figures began to interact more directly. Not just observing, but calling, asking, almost begging for help. It was as if they were trapped between two worlds, and the girl was the key to their release. But how could she help something so dark? With her heart tight, she wondered if there was anything she could do, or if she was doomed to be just another victim of the terror surrounding her. The moon, full and imposing, seemed to be a silent witness to everything, illuminating the horrors she feared more than anything. The girl, completely consumed by the sensation of terror, began to realize that there was something even darker behind these interactions. It wasn't just fear, it was a living nightmare. The figures, which had initially seemed like simple apparitions, now carried a sense of urgency, a desperation in their movements. They no longer watched her from a distance. No, they were calling to her directly, as if they knew she had something they could use. Their eyes, or whatever resembled them, pierced her soul, as if they could see something she didn't understand. The girl didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed her, but an even more disturbing feeling took over. What if she was losing her humanity? With each passing night, they came closer, becoming almost tangible. Their faces, or whatever was left of them, seemed human, but at the same time, they were distorted by the darkness. Terror consumed her completely, and she could no longer distinguish where fear began and reality ended. The shadows, now almost tangible, spun around her, and with every request they made, a heavier weight seemed to be placed on her shoulders. She wanted to run, scream, but the words never came. She was alone in the middle of that spiral of horror, not knowing what to do to escape. The shadows seemed to laugh at her, their low, unmistakable voices whispering in her mind. That night, the girl found herself completely surrounded by the figures. They were no longer just asking for help. Now they seemed to demand something from her. The moon, which illuminated everything in an almost supernatural way, reflected in their eyes, as if it were a silent witness to her fate. The terror that once paralyzed her now pushed her toward a point of no return. And while she struggled to understand what was happening, something worse happened. The shadows began to twist in a grotesque manner, as if space and time themselves were distorting around her. She no longer knew if she could trust her own senses. What was happening here was something no one could explain. Not even the moon knew what to do. And then the girl tried desperately to pull away from the shadows, but something unexpected happened. The moon, so full and bright, began to disappear, leaving everything even darker and more suffocating. The figures, which once seemed almost human, revealed a much more macabre truth. They weren't there to ask for help, but to take what was left of her soul. The fear wrapped around her like a cloak, and before she could take a step, one last shadow emerged from the depths of darkness. A low, almost imperceptible laugh echoed around her, and she finally understood. The shadows would never disappear. They had come to stay, and now she was one of them. Have you ever felt something lurking in the shadows of your own life? Something watching you in your darkest hours? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to keep hearing more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next chapter. The shadows might be closer than you think.